Hello, I'm Cameo George, executive producer of American Experience, PBS's flagship and longest running history series. Thank you for being here. Past Forward Conversations with American Experience is our monthly virtual series where we discuss the enduring themes explored in our films with historians and experts. Today's Past Forward conversation explores how music is commodified and what is lost in the process. It is inspired in part by our new documentary, The War on Disco, now streaming on our website and the PBS app. The War on Disco explores the culture war that erupted over the spectacular rise of disco music. Originating in underground Black and gay clubs, disco had unseated rock as America's most popular music by the late 1970s. But many diehard rock fans view disco with its repetitive beat and culture that emphasize pleasure as shallow and superficial. The hostility came to a head on July 12, 1979, when a riot broke out at Disco Demolition Night during a baseball game in Chicago. In today's conversation, our guests will discuss what is meant by mainstream culture and what happens when an art form moves from its original context to a space of broader appeal. They will explore the emotional and expressive importance of music to different cultures and individuals, and how music can reflect and shape our identities. As always, this is meant to be an interactive conversation. I invite you to write questions in the live chat. We'll answer as many as possible during the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsor, Liberty Mutual Insurance. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, members of the Better Angel Society, including the Fullerton Family Charitable Trust and Bobby and Polly Stein, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the Documentary Investment Group, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, our home station, GBH, and of course, viewers like you. Now, it's my privilege to introduce our panel for this conversation. Jefferson Cowie is the James G. Stahlman Professor of History at Vanderbilt University. Cowie's work in social and political history focuses on how class, race, and labor shape American politics and culture. His latest book, Freedom's Dominion, won the Pulitzer Prize for History in 2023. Ayanna Contreras is a cultural historian, radio DJ, and archivist. She hosts the Reclaimed Soul program on WBEZ and Vocalo Radio in Chicago. She is also a columnist for Downbeat magazine, and her writings have been published in the New York Times, Chicago Review, Oxford American, and others. The conversation today will be moderated by Timothy D. Taylor. Taylor is a professor in the departments of ethnomusicology, anthropology, and musicology at UCLA. Thank you again, and please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Cameo, and welcome to our panelists, Jefferson and Ayanna. I'm delighted and honored to be here with you today to talk about what happens when music goes mainstream. Let's start with some broad questions before we really get into talking about disco. So we know how much culture shapes music and music can shape culture, but there seems to be some moments in American history when that relationship is more salient or stronger than usual. We could talk about the jazz age of the 1920s, and of course we can't talk about the 60s without talking about the music of the 60s. Do you think that the decade of the 70s with disco music was another such moment when the relationship between American culture and music was more powerful or more or better defined than in some other decades?
A Pulitzer Prize winner over here. Uh, I mean, I guess, I would say that perhaps, but, as we sort of dig into in the documentary, that's sort of a divisive flashpoint question when it comes to disco, because I saw in my social media someone had posted about this story, because in Chicago, you say disco demolition and everyone's ears perk up for one reason or another, and definitely saw the smiley face throwing up emoji when the word disco is mentioned even today. So I don't know. I mean, I think to some, it seems a sign of the times of the 70s, like inextricably linked, as I say, but I don't know that it's the definitive music of that decade in the way that rock and roll feels to, from our vantage point, to be the music of 1957, although it wasn't the music of 1957. You know what I'm saying? Revisionist history,
Yeah,
perhaps?
yeah, I agree. I think it's actually kind of interesting because when you think about the music of the '60s, you think of it as a sort of the unifying point of dissent in the '60s was music, and the unifying point of dissent in the '20s was jazz. But in the '70s, it's actually about who, which movement. It becomes more about conflict and a little what we call polarization today. I think about, you mentioned 57 when I think you're referencing Elvis probably, but Lester Bangs' obituary. I don't know, maybe not. But Lester Bangs' obituary for Elvis in '77, which was just an amazing piece, because he says we'll never agree on anything else again. It's all going to be sort of balkanization of tastes from here on out, right? And I mean, he's overstating the meaning of Elvis, I think, but the fact that at that moment, that kind of tension in the culture, even among the youth culture, whatever that is, it was palpable.
Yeah, I'm the only one here who's old enough to remember that era, and even in a small town in Michigan where I grew up, you could not escape disco. We even played a version of the Hustle in our marching band, as I recall. So even though there were no clubs to go to, it was still absolutely ubiquitous, and in some ways did become, if not the soundtrack of the late '70s, it was part of that soundtrack.
There was, there's
So
a
one of the
picture of
things that,
sorry, this is weird delay. Yeah, I no, they taught the hustle in my
yeah.
gym class, junior high.
So one of the things that the film considers is how disco went mainstream, and not all musics go mainstream. And how would you define what that term means with respect to disco or any other music? I mean, what is it to say that something has gone mainstream?
I'm happy
I
to.
defer.
Yeah. You know, I would say most of the time, music, when it's removed from its original space of incubation, wherever that is, that's when it starts moving into the mainstream. So some music, like jazz, for instance, or disco, or any sort of dance related music, will have started in a club space, right? Like it's moving out of the clubs into, often, when we're talking about 20th century and specifically, into a mass media situation. Like that mass media starts disseminating it into spaces and places outside of that initial subculture that helped seed it. That's taking off of the table this concept of monetization of the music. It's just the level of exposure becomes different.
Yeah, why are you taking monetization off the table? It seems like
Because I mean,
part of that.
that part of it may or may not happen.
Okay.
It's not assumed that that's going to happen, that the actual people who produce this music, that subculture, is going to benefit, and maybe it might be picked up by a larger corporation, and maybe not, I don't know. But in terms of whether it becomes mainstream or not, that that's not necessarily the defining factor, that it becomes profitable per se, I don't think.
Yeah,
But
no,
I don't know.
I would agree. Yeah, you have a sort of underground to sort of emerging to a broader cultural level, and then possibly
Right, because
commodity
I think
or
things sometimes
over
hit a
commodity.
cultural zeitgeist
Right.
that don't become necessarily super profitable,
Hmm.
you know.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, punk
Because I would
wasn't
argue
exactly.
today that things don't, there's things that have hit the cultural zeitgeist that have not become profitable, but that's because the quote unquote way in which mass media works in the culture is very different than it used to. Even that idea of, the big 3 TV stations and only a couple of radio
Mm.
stations in the market is really foreign at this point.
Totally.
Yeah, my students don't get it. I mean, I have to explain to them what a network is because they don't really understand anymore. So one of the things that the film makes us think about is the question of commodification and music as a commodity, and that's a pretty complicated issue because on the one hand, it looks like all music is a commodity because we're surrounded by it. I mean, Taylor Swift is prime example of somebody who is profiting from their commodified music, but as I often say to students and others, most of the musicians I know are dying to have their music commodified so they can make a living. So, we're kind of fooled into thinking that all music is a commodity because it seems to be everywhere. But, for every Taylor Swift, there's thousands of people who can't make a living at music. So, what happened with respect to disco? How did this become a commodified music when it started, as Ayana points out, in a very local way among specific populations?
Yeah, there was some evidence that it was already peaking when Saturday Night Fever came out. It was on as a popular, in the popular realm, that it already sort of was on its way down. And John Travolta even talks about the fact that he felt like he was getting involved in a sort of retrospective already at that point. But obviously, the film and those dance scenes, sort of relaunched it and drilled it into every nook and cranny of the American psyche.
Right. And the film allowed a level of being able to be a fly on the wall in a situation that you might not have experienced in Fargo necessarily. I mean, it's sort of like, when you hear about a history of Soul Train, what Soul Train did was it allowed a whole lot of people who did not have that level of access to Black popular music, that level of access into the dances as they happen, into the styles as they happen. It's an immediate way for people to access that particular cultural capital. So like that film, to your point, part of why it like probably reignited the thing is it actually really introduced sort of the nuance of the culture in its, kind of movie glossy way to a lot of folks that otherwise might have seen bits and pieces, like as a musical guest on Saturday Night Live performed or something to that effect. There was no MTV. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think those sorts of visual representations of the culture were really salient, really important in those moments.
Yeah, you really saw it after, whether it was Soul Train or Cream magazine or Rolling Stone or whatever your venue way to get in. Any tidbit on what was going on, they were sort of hard, to your point, hard won and hard fought, right? And because people were hungry for it. The irony of Saturday Night Fever, though, and which is not in the movie, is that it was based on a fabricated story. That the Nick Cohn, who wrote the piece for New York Magazine, made the whole thing up. So it's sort of it's sort of a weird '70s simulacra where, the reality is based on something that's sort of several steps removed from whatever reality used to be.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, in
Um,
fact, it's
so,
interesting in the article there's an inset that says all of this is true. We checked it out, and none of it was true.
so let's talk a little bit more about the origins of disco. Ayana, can you talk about the origins and how it got to be so popular?
Man, America loves a creation myth, right? Like we love that it started here at this intersection in 1973. I mean, I think everyone can kind of agree that disco, as we think of it, as being a four on the floor, like sort of Latin funky dance music, black music, gay music thing, really quote unquote started in Chicago, but the whole concept of dancing to a DJ playing records obviously well predated that idea. Live music was king, then the jukebox was king, and then the DJ started taking over those spaces. It's interesting because the term discotheque was even popular as far back as, I would say, the 1960s, especially in places like London and Paris and also New York. That wasn't an uncommon phrase, but it wasn't the cultural zeitgeist, I would say. I would argue 74 and into 75 was when it was really taking off. As things being the first time I can remember seeing a record that says disco on it, like referring to this type of music, be 74 and into 75. And then RCA actually started reissuing shorter songs that had been released as shorter records in 1975, put them out in a special disco mix into 1975. And the rest, when the recording industry started to really take heed of what was happening in the clubs in terms of extending music via the two turntable remix, that was part of what actually helped it be codified as a recording style, like a music style, as opposed to just a cultural scene.
Yeah, that's what I always associated with, was the sort of continuous play from two turntables. That was kind of the breakthrough.
Yeah. Because there are songs, as we mentioned in the documentary, as far back as, I would say, 72, that fill that archetypal thing. So you can we talked about Soul Makossa in the film. There's also I'll Be Around by the Spinners, The Love I Lost by Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes. All of those I would classify as prototypical disco music.
So we've talked a little bit about disco and American culture, but can we dig in a little bit more and talk about what disco can tell us about the 70s? I mean, any music or any kind of cultural production is always going to register what's going on in the cultures. So what did disco register that we can learn about the 70s?
Depends on when in the 70s. I think the message of disco is different at different points of the 70s. And I think the point that the documentary seems to want to make is that it's a bit of a microcosm of the transformations of the era, from the underground sort of dance scene that Ayanna was just talking about, with this long kind of gestation period in the early 70s, or even going back further, to a sort of commodification and an emphasis on a sort of more mainstreaming, and then commodification, and then backlash. And it sort of follows a full arc that follows the entire era of the 1970s. And it wasn't until actually I saw the film and put the pieces together that I realized it kind of, the way it goes from a sort of democratic underground place of exploration, and where people can get together in different ways, and in a sort of subversive way, becomes the gated community of Studio 54 and elite sort of structure that's going to presage the Reagan era. It sort of follows a kind of perfect arc of the decade.
Well, we have a clip queued up, so sorry, do you want to say something, Anna?
No, I was just conferring.
Okay.
Simple conferring.
Okay. So in The War on Disco, this film, we learned that disco music rapidly rose in popularity in the late 70s, but it wasn't embraced by everyone, famously. So we have a clip. Let's watch a clip from the film that explores how ubiquitous disco became.
Pretty soon, that phrase came up a lot.
I hate disco. I think it sucks, man.
Disco sucks!
Plastic ladies. Made up of plastic ladies, plastic men.
I think anytime something gets commodified, it becomes less
popular ultimately because of overexposure.
You'll catch the fever at Potemkin with 1979
the Disco Body Shaper, the brand new age.
Disco has grown to a $5 billion a year business.
With the commodification of disco, it's sort of this very corporate machine sounding music.
It becomes mass produced. Everything becomes a disco beat.
Everything is becoming a little bit kitschy, like Ethel Merman making a disco album.
You've got a ridiculous record like Disco Duck.
It was a natural thing that eventually disco would have a backlash.
So Ayanna, we're wondering about how you view this backlash. Can you talk some more about this? Was this sort of backlash unusual in the history of American popular music?
Not just popular music, but popular culture. How many things have we seen that hit that zeitgeist and we're like, enough? I can name some names, but I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, you know? But I mean, it's definitely that narrative arc, I think, is a well-trod tale that we've seen many, many times before. Overexposure equals get that thing away from me quick. But also, you know, if in the underground, what disco was about liberation and getting free and even just like expressing yourself in ways that maybe you couldn't express yourself in a public space, like you were free in the club to do so, as was the case for many folks. You could almost be someone else, right? I think that once it got into this super mass-produced, glossy version of itself, and it was talking about clams on the half shell and roller skates, right? Like, I think it actually was fairly far removed from what the essence of the music and the culture was. So there was a backlash from people who were like, disco sucks, long live Thin Lizzy. But there's also people like, this disco sucks. This is not my disco.
Right, and the Thin Lizzy crowd. The irony of that is that somehow '70s rock and roll, in its stadium version, is some version of authenticity, as opposed to the artificiality of corporate-driven disco, where every rock star at this point is essentially talking about how much money they're making. And so that backlash is more than just taste. I think that if we take that seriously, that means we're bending into questions of race, gender, sexuality, and sort of policing the margins of a kind of white patriarchal masculinity.
But also, there's also this in-between thing, right? So, I mean, thinking about maybe there was a slippery slope conversation happening because there were a lot of rock artists. It wasn't just Ethel Merman that were making disco records that weren't necessarily bad records in my guesstimation, right? Like Bruce Johnson from the Beach Boys did a song called Pipeline, which is a real, true disco record. You had the Hollies doing Dragging My Heels. That was a big record. You had Chicago doing Street Player, real disco, like they were doing it. So I don't know where that falls in the whole conversation.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I'm probably maybe not that much, a little bit younger than Tim, but not a lot. And so in high school, I remember people coming in and talking about artists had gone disco, like they were fallen soldiers in the culture war. Yeah. And they had, the Stones did a disco, Rod Stewart did a disco, and they were so clearly just cashing in on a fad.
It's like, this is the other thing that's very interesting, especially in the case of the Rolling Stones, in thinking about those songs that they did were adopted and embraced by Black listeners. Mm-hmm. And played on Black radio and were huge songs in those communities. Like, we love that music. I can think about David Bowie, that whole Young Americans album, like he played Soul Train on that, you know? So I don't know, maybe from one side, it seems to be they're going to the dark side, but then on the other side, it's like, oh, these people who claim to be inspired by Black culture and music, they're finally making a record that we really resonate with. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm talking about the reception amongst sort of the what we would call the backlash, not the production side. Like, from the sort of, blue jean rock crowd, white rock crowd, it was like, oh, we lost another one, another one. And I think, even though, it's like when in LA when all the fans threw bottles at Prince, when he opened for the Stones, because he was effeminate and black, and completely ignoring the entire Roots name and everything else of the Rolling Stones. So I'm on the reception side for a particular demographic, not really the production
Correct.
side.
I'm just giving that fair and balanced perception of it.
Is that what you need, fair and balanced?
Well, what I remember of the 70s was, and with respect to disco, is that it was really, there were just two opposite sides. The rock and roll people were like, rock music is about kicking butt, and the disco people were about shaking, and it was just an unbridgeable gap, at least for a while. And I think that was part of the class divide, but also, the other divides that made people either love disco or hate it forever. But it resulted in some heated arguments and discussions, as I recall.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. What about, since we're talking about these different reactions to disco, and one of the striking things about it is that it was popular among completely different groups. I mean, like we've already mentioned, African Americans, Latinx people, gay people, which is really fairly unusual for any kind of popular music to have an audience that's that broad, but also with distinct subgroups. Why do you think that is, that it could attract such disparate groups of people?
Well, I don't know that they're that disparate. I mean, because if you look at that, that's the same framework of folks that embraced and really helped lift up like house music later on, right? But and jazz to some extent, like very disparate groups of people embraced jazz in the beginnings and throughout until it became sort of like, well, we could go into some directions of where jazz went. But I think, I think when a message resonates with people, right, you're going to adopt that music if you have access to that music. And the 20th century, from where we started out in 1900 to where we wound up, the level of access to music from people who weren't like yourself were kept increasing exponentially. So you didn't have to listen to the music of your community, your direct geographical community, if you didn't need to. I mean, think about like, quote unquote, Northern soul in the UK and those spaces, like how they, to those folks, that is their music, but by all intents and purposes, it is 100% not a creation of, the UK. It's a creation of urban centers in the United States of America by Black people.
Right. But they're always right alongside of, the progenitors of all those people you mentioned were sort of the progenitors of this entire genre. And if we go all the way back to the 50s or whenever, there was always kind of the R&B and then the Pat Boone whitewashed cover of it for a different demographic, right? And that was all cleaned up. And I remember Pat Boone wanted to change "Ain't That a Shame" to "Isn't That a Shame." So that kind of thing that there's a sort of more authentic is always a fraught word, right? But there's a more sort of indigenous version that rises from the streets and the clubs And then there's always a sort of this next phase that becomes a little more whitewashed, a little more corporate, a little more label driven, a little more money driven.
So the film goes into some detail with some interesting footage about this riot in Kaminsky Park in Chicago. So do you think that the interpretation of disco by Steve Dahl, this DJ who instigated this riot, and others, were they? I mean, did they have a point, or were they just reacting against disco for homophobic or racist reasons?
See, this is the thing. Like, I can't say, and I they use my clip in the movie, which is very funny. But I can't say that his point was. He has said that his point was not about that. But I can't. I also can't say that he did not know that he was like touching a sort of cultural nerve point in order to get sort of the rabble roused crowd engaged. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you listen to some of the clips of his air checks of him talking back then, just making folks feel alienated and angry and like, we will not be replaced. But, I don't want to. I think there is truly, when you see some of the folks who have done retrospectives about this moment, they are putting some revisionist things onto it now. Yes, as a Black person in the community, it would be very easy to look at that riot and be afraid. Point blank, understanding the mechanics of Chicago and the segregation and, all that sort of thing, really understand that is frightening. But I don't know that when the White Sox promotion team and the Loop promotion team were like, we're going to get these kids out to blow some stuff up, I don't know that intention was, we're gonna show these Black people who's boss. I don't know that was the point. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of a yes and answer, but yeah.
I think that's a really fair answer. But we also have to think about masculinity too. I mean, the number of times Steve Dahl made reference to balls and chest hair and gold medallions, and that all of this seemed to be a sort of a threat to that kind of masculinity that seemed to be under threat from a variety of directions, from the ERA and the Roe decision and the women's movement and all that kind of stuff that's going on, that's sort of rattling the sort of patriarchal system at the time. And I think in a lot of ways that the fear of an effeminate version of masculinity, or the sort of opening up the boundaries between what's been a dichotomy for so long is also at work. It's not just race. And of course,
it's also interesting, to your point, right? I think it's interesting because if you look at sort of how popular rock even evolved, like there was obviously a point in the late 1960s into the early 1970s where like what was considered acceptable masculine physical representation was very, I think peacock has been a term that's been used, right? Like lots of big necklaces and even feathers and paisley and velvet and all these other things. And then there was a point in the early 1970s, I'm thinking like Creedence Clearwater Revival, when everybody needed to look more like a lumberjack. And then you got glam rock, which for some reason really didn't, the original glam rock, not the 80s version, but the original glam rock, which for some reason the United States was very, very slow to adopt. And maybe that's because it was a more ostentatious and some would argue feminized view of rock. Maybe there's a nuance there that could be explored as well. It's interesting.
Yeah, somebody like Bowie was always more, I think, had more appeal to the art school crowd in the U.S. In that way. But the weird thing that I think about with this is Queen, Freddie Mercury's Queen, falls in the rock side, despite all the sequins and the androgyny he plays with, and even the name of the band. I've always wondered why that in the 70s and early 80s fell on that side of the equation?
It's a good question.
Yeah, good question. I have no answer. Well, we have another clip queued up. This is from the film exploring what happens when the anti-disco backlash exploded in 1979.
Saturday Night Fever, the soundtrack, Staying Alive, that walk of John Travolta. He's wearing his, bell bottoms with his platform shoes. That walk with the song is really what catapulted disco right over the top, made it so mainstream around the world.
Disco was everywhere at this time. You were getting constant messages that you had to look a certain way. A lot of people just felt like they were being excluded because they weren't cool enough to get into the disco.
I don't think we need to feel stupid because we can't be part of this new trendy thing that's happening when it's ridiculous.
There was a before and there was an after.
50,000 people showed up at Chicago's Comiskey Park. Many had come for Disco Demolition Night.
Disco sucks! You don't like the Village People?
They had the idea of blowing up these disco records. And I thought, that is going to be so cool.
I hope they don't let you people see what's going on here at Comiskey Park. One of the saddest sights I've ever seen at a ballpark in my life.
There were some people who really were anti-disco, and in the aftermath of disco demolition, a lot of folks sort of washed their hands of the whole scene.
We have to destroy all disco.
Radio stations stopped playing disco music overnight.
This whole disco hate and disco demolition was a nightmare for many of us in the industry and for the people who enjoyed the music.
To the degree we're looking for the origins of our time, I think we're looking for those moments, those divides that help to explain how we got where we are.
This is an early episode in what we call the culture wars. People were fighting over what is the kind of music that should be valued.
Disco had so much meaning. Music matters to people quite deeply. And to threaten that is to threaten who they are on either side of this divide.
They're not going to shove it down our throats. We rock and rollers will resist, and we will triumph.
Well, there's a lot of things we could talk about in that clip. We've talked about the backlash already, but one of the things that really strikes me about not just that clip, but some other parts of the film is how especially LGBTQ plus folks used disco to kind of construct a public identity that hadn't been available to them before. I'm not a historian of LGBTQ plus people, but I was really struck by how people, especially the patrons of some of these clubs, how they talked about that. Did that strike you too? Do you have any ideas about, identity fashioning through disco in this period?
Yeah, I mean, this is 10 years after Stonewall, right? So the sort of, sit-in movement, Stonewall is to the gay rights movement as the bus sit-ins and the lunch counter sit-ins to the civil rights movement. And so this is 10 years after that. This is the gay pride parades are happening throughout the decade. Harvey Milk is becoming a prominent politician in San Francisco, and the anti-gay rights initiatives are being defeated. Florida winning, and so this is the age in which gay people are coming out of the closet. And policing those boundaries became very important to a lot of people who were afraid of what that meant for sexuality in America.
But there was also a lot of coded things happening, right? So it wasn't as out as we use the term being out. It was sort of like, yes, I'm wearing eyeshadow and sort of, if that makes sense. Like there's a lot of folks whose identity, so there's a group called the Dynamic Superiors, and the lead vocalist, they're signed to Motown Records, eyeshadow, blush, whole nine. You can think about Sylvester, when Sylvester really hit the mainstream, another artist who is kind of female presenting, but not identifying as female. So there's like a gender non-conforming element to that. You could also think about Carl Bean with that anthem, I Was Born This Way, which became a gay rights anthem. It was a disco anthem. Like there was a lot of things happening, but the language was still very often very coded because the rest of the world still wasn't quite ready, but folks were still itching for spaces where they could just be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but it was still but it was still the shock of the new, I think, for a lot of people.
For a lot of people, but the underground culture, especially like in black
I'm not
clubs,
talking about the underground. Yeah, no, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm talking more about the people who are storming the stands at Comiskey Park.
For sure.
So, yeah. So, no, we can trace the underground gay culture ad infinitum backwards through time. But the sort of revolution in publicness in its various guises, I think, happens in the 70s. I had a question for you guys that came up in that clip, and not to hijack the host's chair, but
no, please.
Do you remember the name of Steve Dahl's army? The Insane Coho Lips Army. That was you were a member of the Coho Lips Army if you signed up with Steve Dahl's group, and my understanding is that the Coho were victims of the invasion of the lamprey eel in Lake Michigan, and that it was an invasive species that were threatening the indigenous species of Lake Michigan at the time. And the lamprey eels were terrible parasitic fish that were killing. So it's my understanding. If there's anybody out there who has a different understanding, I'd love to hear it. So I'm just wondering if, I think that metaphor of, oh, no, we're the indigenous and these outsiders are coming in to destroy our culture, and put that in scare
so
quotes,
interesting.
is, yeah.
Huh.
Yeah,
Are
look
you
at the buttons and
familiar
stuff.
The book
Sounds familiar.
Mumbo Jumbo by Ishmael Reed, which it was
Yeah.
written in so like for folks who aren't familiar, it's like I think it came out in the early 1970s, but basically it's sort of a fable, for lack of a better term, built around the growth of jazz and the backlash of jazz in 1920s era, and they're not calling it jazz, they're calling it just grew, like this invasive just grew thing that's taking over the culture. And that was immediately what came to mind when you said that. So interesting.
We're into the period of audience. Sorry, Jeff?
Oh, I just said that similar things were probably said about rock and roll in the 50s. So.
For sure. Absolutely, 100%.
So we've got some time for audience questions, and they're coming in. First one is interesting, which is to say they want us to comment on the question of commodification, because it's easy to assume that commodification is bad. But, Ayana mentioned Sol Mokasa a while ago, and Manu Dibango would not have been able to make that music if he hadn't heard commodified American music coming to Cameroon, where he was from. So the question is about, I'll just read it. Considering the ultimate fate of disco in the U.S., is it better for an art form to be commodified if it begins reaching a wider audience, or should it be preserved within its original space?
I don't think that it was the commodification that ruined it, but I think it was the commodification that took it on a path that ultimately got to overexposure. It was the overexposure part, I think, that really was the death knell for the music being in the mainstream, like what caused it to be pushed back down. I mean,
like you said, Tim,
right? Yes,
yeah.
I'm
You
sure you're
just
going to
said
say I was going to say.
the dream of every artist is to
Sorry.
be commodified, right, in some way, shape, or form, because you got to put bread and butter on the table. But I think overexposure is the exact word. It's like, it's saturated, and every time I see that opening strut, John Travolta, it's great. It moves me. It's a great soundtrack and a great theme. So, to the degree that's part of the commodification, I don't know. It's still to this day. If you want to get people out on the dance floor at a wedding or something, you play some disco.
Yeah, I had Linda Clifford on my radio show years ago. It was interesting because I had an interview that she had conducted at a radio station here in Chicago. I had the reel-to-reel tape, and she hadn't heard it since it happened in 1978, interestingly enough. And I had the original host who did the interview, and we were talking about that moment, and there was so much pride, and she was so excited that the record that they were talking about had done so well, and it exposed her to a whole new world of people and whatever. But then it got real dark after that because everything she had built was like kind of, as she alludes to in the film, is gone, and she never really got that back.
Yeah, the cost of that of the
backlash,
disco sucks. Yeah, it was just extraordinary. And I think, artists who barely had a toehold on that, on their hopes of being commodified, lost out.
Yeah. Here's a question which would probably be good to end with, but I want to make sure we have enough time. So this one is, what is the biggest misconception about disco and the backlash to disco that you are dying to address?
For me, that was a universal backlash, that everybody hated disco and disco sucked and all of these other things, which I meet people every single day that love disco of all like races, cultures, and creeds, that love the music, never stopped loving the music, felt connected to the music. So I just don't see that as being a universal reality. I see that as being a reality.
I completely agree with that. And I think the one argument I would try to make would be about the sort of something I said earlier, was how much it tracks the history of the 70s and how it becomes a bit of from the first half of the 70s is so much about a kind of connected to the 60s sense of liberation and collective underground sort of struggle and expression. And then by the end of the decade, it's much more of a kind of commodified and elite. If we look at the People magazine Studio 54 version of it, what's lost in that decade in the breach in terms of the general culture, not necessarily in terms of artistic culture.
Great answers. I'm glad we had time for that one, even though it would be a good ending, like I said. Here's another one. Did disco ever really die?
Disco TM, probably, but underground dance music culture, absolutely not. It was definitely a never-ending flow.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
Yeah, no, I remember in the 90s, electronica was the next big thing for a while. And that, that came straight out of techno and disco before that. How is it alive today?
I mean, I would argue that the largest arbiter is probably house and to some degree EDM, but really house music really sees itself as a continuation. And here in Chicago, the way we talk about house music, there are a lot of songs that people consider house music that actually were disco songs, that were what the earliest house DJs were playing. That was the initial music, because before house was a produced music form, it was a style of DJing.
Following up on that, did this have to happen in Chicago? I mean, what? Like, Detroit had a anti-disco movement that was very explicitly racist, actually. And is there something about the music scene in Chicago or just the racial scene, do you think?
I mean, definitely the racial scene, but then also Chicago, someone who was following the American Express, or excuse me, American Experience Twitter feed had asked the question, like, was this even something that was a thing outside of Chicago? I think Chicago at that point was still the second largest market and second largest city in the country. So if something like that happens in a city that large, it just got a little more attention and it was a little more documented. And because it was a large media market, record labels were taking notice, Billboard was taking notice. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think that there was that element of it where it sort of was larger than life because it was happening in a city that large.
But it's hard to imagine it happening in Shea Stadium. It just seems. I mean, maybe
That's true.
Maybe I don't know. It's just, there's something Midwestern about it. It seems to me.
Well, I mean, I can't see it. It's a Bridgeport thing for me, though. I don't know that. I honestly, I don't know that I could have seen it happening in Wrigley. I mean, it could have happened in Wrigley, but I don't know that they would have let that happen in Wrigley. I don't know. Comiskey, as we mentioned in the film, which if you haven't seen it, I recommend it. The neighborhood in which Comiskey Park stood, it no longer stands. There's another stadium that's taken that mantle as being the Sox Park. But anyway, it is in a neighborhood that is known for being sort of a historical sundown town of sorts that already had sort of a vibe.
It's Mayor Daley's neighborhood, right? Yeah.
Yeah, among other things.
Yeah. But a lot. I think another myth. Somebody asked about the myth. I think a lot of those kids were suburban, and from outside the city and took the train in.
For sure.
Sort of,
I don't know that a lot of them, but I mean, but also a lot of that population, that the younger sort of baby boom white generation still was raised in Chicago and had recently moved to Algonquin or Lisle or wherever.
Yeah, I'm from right outside of Algonquin.
How did I know that? I swear I'm psychic about this. Is the third time this has happened this week where I've just like called somebody out.
Town called Crystal Lake. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Did you go to Central?
I did. Except it wasn't even called Central then.
It was just.
It was just the one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What was I going to say about that though? Yeah. So, which connects to white flight, right? Which is what implicit in your answer, which is that the previous generation that left Chicago basically on racial grounds. It was white people leaving the city throughout the Rust Belt as a sort of container for unemployed people they wanted nothing to do with. They didn't want busing, they didn't want integration, and so they left. So to go back and sort of fight this, it sort of makes sense to me in a certain way. I don't think we have any data on who was there, but
we still have some audience questions. So one of them is, what, if anything, did disco lose when it was absorbed into mainstream culture?
Street cred. No.
Yeah, something subversive, something challenging to mainstream culture, something underground, alternative.
Yeah,
I mean, that often happens.
I think so. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I try to drive home to my students is a lot of the early social movements, the late 60s and 70s around gender and race and sexuality, weren't interested in sort of being in, heteronormative bourgeois life. They wanted to change the way it worked. And it was a challenge to how the whole thing was rigged, not just we want to get in on it. And so I think that sort of that's lost a little bit, quite a bit actually, once it moves from the underground scenes to disco duck.
Another question. You've talked about fear and misunderstanding leading to disco opposition. Did commercialization play into this fear and misunderstanding?
For whom? I guess is maybe the rest of them.
I think the presumption is the backlash. Disco sucks, folks.
I guess I'm not a good representative of the disco sucks people. Because, as a person who, I grew up.
I would hope not.
No, yeah. Well, it's interesting because I grew up in, house was nascent and was growing. And then ultimately, I started hearing the disco sex thing maybe in the 90s. There was still like reverberations still kind of in the culture, like disco's horrible. And when you thought about what disco was, it was sort of this over bloated polyester nightmare. Do you remember when they used to say that the 70s was the decade that taste forgot, which actually initially was the 1940s, by the way. That's where that phrase came from. But thinking about like how that wound up being the top note of how people remembered the music, I think is so sad, because there's so much beauty and gorgeousness of that era that's not cheesy and corny. And rest her soul, Ethel Merman singing disco.
Oh my God, I'm never gonna quite get over that one.
Me neither.
But there was something else from the outside. I although I took no part or had no truck with the disco sucks movement whatsoever, but that's it's a little more my demographic, I guess. There was something decadent about it at a time of crisis, I think, for a lot of people. That it was, there was the latest incarnation, the most sort of the Studio 54 version, the hyper commodification version seemed, post 77 seemed. I think I say in the documentary, partying through the apocalypse, because things were bleak. For everybody in the middle of stagflation, and one way we dealt with this throughout world history is dancing. Another is to sort of dance solipsistically and behind the red rope.
So we've got just a couple of minutes left for a final question. So in keeping with the overall theme of the film, we're wondering about what happens not just when the music becomes commodified, but in this case, commercialized. Is this necessarily a bad thing? Might not be a bad thing for musicians if you're making money.
If you're making money, that's the key, right?
There seems to be a point at which, maybe we think commodifying a music is okay, so people can earn a living, but then is there a point beyond that when it becomes commercialized or over commodified? We've talked about this a little bit, but now it's time for final thoughts.
I would say I think that there's, going back to the revisionist history aspect of it, thinking about how generationally there's different ways to, think about it, like Gen Z, the whole concept of selling out is completely foreign. That is not a thing that is a Gen Z thing. But you talk to somebody Gen X, it's like, that artist sold out. They're on a Pepsi commercial. They're horrible. So I don't know that there's a definitive answer to that, but I do think that in this era, most artists would love to have the level of exposure that some of these artists had back then, to where the lens was that mighty. It's unfortunate that the natural next step to that was, I can't stand seeing this person anymore. I don't ever want to see, and I'm purposely not naming names of folks because I don't want to create pariahs out of these people that were created into pariahs in the year of our Lord 1980. I say 1980 because 1979 still had a lot of big disco. It was 80, 81 where things really started to kind of fall apart.
We're supposed to wrap up, but Jeff, I want to give you the opportunity.
Oh yeah, one quick thought on that, and that is what we lack now is the album deal, which was the sine qua non of commodification, commercialization of an artist back in the day. Now it's all Spotify and whatever the case may be, and so actually trying to make some money, as a labor guy, I always say there's only one thing worse than not being exploited, and that's not being exploited. And so opportunity to be in commercials or television shows or whatever the case, which used to be an absolute pariah because it got in the way of art, is one of the central ways of staying afloat.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been enlightening and a lot of fun. I hope the viewers think so too. Now I'll send it back to Carmen or for Cameo for closing remarks.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us today for this conversation exploring what happens when music is commercialized. The War on Disco is now available to stream in full on our website and in the PBS app. You can watch our past forward conversations anytime on our YouTube channel or on our website. And if you liked what you saw today, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for our events newsletter. You'll be the first to know about new conversations, opportunities to watch new films live with us, and more. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great day.